The year was 1587, and England's winter lay heavy upon the land. At Fotheringhay Castle, the frost clung to the stone walls, and the air inside was as cold as the politics outside. Behind thick doors, guarded by soldiers whose eyes never softened, lived a woman who had once been crowned a queen in her own right. Now she was a prisoner, and had been for nearly 2 decades. Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, had come to England not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive, fleeing rebellion in her own land. She had expected sanctuary from her cousin, Elizabeth Tudor, the Queen of England. Instead, she found herself caged. From 1568 until the winter of 1587, Mary was moved from castle to castle, her freedoms shrinking, her power dwindling. Yet her presence never ceasing to haunt Elizabeth's reign. She was more than a dethroned monarch. She was a living threat. To Elizabeth's Protestant counselors, Mary was the Catholic figurehead around whom plots swirled, a queen with a stronger blood claim to the English throne in the eyes of many. To Catholics across Europe, she was the rightful queen, the woman who could restore their faith to England. And to Elizabeth, she was a shadow that darkened every decision, a cousin, a rival, a mirror of her own precarious hold on power. Inside Fotheringhay's gray walls, Mary was 54 years old, her body weakened by rheumatism, her hair graying beneath her headdress. But age and illness had not broken her spirit. She still carried herself with the poise of royalty, still spoke with the confidence of one born to rule. Servants whispered of her dignity even in confinement. She walked slowly, leaning on attendants, but her gaze burned with the memory of crowns. Her chambers were modest compared to her youth in France, when she had been wed to a king and draped in silks. At Fotheringhay, her bed was heavy oak, her tapestries faded, her meals controlled. Every letter she wrote, every visitor she received, every mass she heard, all were monitored, censored, or forbidden. And yet Mary adapted. She prayed, she embroidered, she plotted. Above all, she waited. 19 years in captivity did not soften her claim. Instead, it sharpened it. Each passing year gave her more weight in Catholic eyes, more sympathy abroad. She was the daughter of James V of Scotland, the widow of the French King Francis II, and by blood, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII of England. Her lineage was undeniable, her claim to the English throne unshakable to those who despised Elizabeth as the illegitimate child of Anne Boleyn. But imprisonment was not the only chain she bore. She was shackled by Elizabeth's paranoia, by Walsingham's spies, by the ceaseless plots of conspirators who invoked her name, often without her consent. Mary's captivity became both cage and crucible. Every whisper of rebellion in Catholic Europe seemed to lead back to her, whether she had willed it or not. Yet even stripped of crown and power, she cultivated her image. She was still a queen, and she would not allow her captors to forget it. She signed her letters with regal flourish. She dressed as richly as her circumstances allowed. She carried herself as though her throne awaited her just beyond the horizon. Her enemies saw a prisoner, her supporters saw a monarch in exile, awaiting restoration. It was this duality, helpless and yet dangerous, defeated and yet unbroken, that made Mary's existence unbearable for Elizabeth. For 19 years, Elizabeth resisted the calls to execute her cousin. To kill Mary was to kill a queen, a sacred figure anointed by God. It risked provoking Catholic powers abroad, even inviting invasion. But to leave her alive was to court rebellion from within. Elizabeth walked that tightrope until it frayed. and Mary knew it. She sensed her fate moving closer, step by step, each passing year. By the winter of 1587, the walls of Fotheringhay no longer felt like a prison of waiting, but a holding cell before judgment. When guards entered her chamber and bowed stiffly, when messengers arrived with sealed orders, when she saw the unease in her attendants' eyes, she knew her time was nearly over. But Mary was no ordinary prisoner. She was a queen, and she had resolved long ago how she would face her end. Not with pleading, not with silence, but with the dignity of a monarch and the defiance of a martyr. As February approached, Mary's enemies sharpened their plans. Across the Channel, Europe held its breath. In London, Elizabeth vacillated, torn between reluctance and necessity. At Fotheringhay, Mary prayed and prepared, for she had lived 19 years as a queen in chains. Now she was about to die as a queen in blood. The long years of Mary Stuart's captivity might have been endured in uneasy stalemate had it not been for a single, fateful conspiracy, one that finally gave her enemies the weapon they needed. It came in 1586 in the form of a plot that would be remembered by history as the Babington Plot. For decades, Catholic Europe had dreamed of restoring England to the Pope's authority. Elizabeth's Protestant settlement, forged in the blood of martyrs and the ashes of monasteries, was despised in Rome and Madrid. The Pope had excommunicated Elizabeth, absolving her subjects of loyalty to her. France whispered of crusade. Spain's Philip II sharpened his blades for war. And through it all, Mary, Queen of Scots, remained their rallying point. In her veins ran the blood of the Tudors, the Valois, and the Stuarts, a living banner of legitimacy to every Catholic who saw Elizabeth as a bastard and usurper. Elizabeth's chief minister, Sir Francis Walsingham, understood the danger better than anyone. Cold, brilliant, and relentless, he had constructed a web of spies and informers that stretched from London taverns to foreign embassies. For years, he had intercepted messages, broken codes, and sniffed out conspiracies. But until the mid-1580s, no plot had directly tied Mary herself to regicide. Walsingham needed proof, not only of rebellion, but of Mary's own hand moving against Elizabeth's life. The trap was baited by a young Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington. Fired with zeal and reckless ambition, Babington gathered a circle of conspirators who dreamed of assassinating Elizabeth, freeing Mary, and restoring Catholicism to the throne of England. They smuggled letters in and out of Mary's chambers at Fotheringhay, hidden in the hollow stoppers of beer barrels. Mary, starved of news and desperate for allies, seized the chance. In ciphered script, she wrote letters encouraging her supporters, approving plans for foreign invasion, and, fatefully, giving tacit blessing to Elizabeth's removal. She may not have ordered Elizabeth's assassination outright, but her endorsement was enough. What Mary did not know was that every letter passed first through Walsingham's hands. His agents had cracked the code, and each word she wrote sealed her doom. When the trap was sprung, the conspirators were seized and dragged to execution. Their deaths were grisly, drawn, hanged, and quartered in a spectacle meant to terrify. Yet the greater prize was Mary herself. At last, Walsingham had the proof he craved, ink on parchment that could be read aloud in court, tying a queen to conspiracy against a queen. Mary was summoned before a tribunal at Fotheringhay in October 1586. It was no ordinary trial, but a performance of power. Arrayed against her were English peers, judges and officials, with Walsingham himself hovering like a shadow, every word of her correspondence catalogued. Mary, denied her own counsel, stood alone. But she did not flinch. She defended herself with eloquence, insisting that as a foreign sovereign, she could not be judged by English law. She denied plotting Elizabeth's death, declaring that she had written only in hope of liberation, not regicide. She turned her accusers' words back upon them with razor-sharp wit, exposing contradictions in their charges. Witnesses later admitted that she spoke with the authority of a queen, facing down an assembly that had already condemned her. And condemned she was. The verdict was inevitable, written long before the trial began. On October 25th, Mary was found guilty of conspiring to assassinate Elizabeth and incite rebellion within England. Her sentence was death. Yet even now, the execution of a queen was no simple matter. Elizabeth hesitated. To kill Mary was to kill an anointed sovereign, a woman crowned by the hand of God. It was to provoke outrage across Catholic Europe, perhaps even to ignite war. Elizabeth, ever cautious, lingered in indecision. For weeks she delayed, quill hovering over parchment, as counselors pressed her to sign. But politics cares little for conscience. Parliament clamored for blood. Walsingham and Lord Burghley warned of fresh plots if Mary lived. The people, too, demanded security. In the end, Elizabeth relented. In February 1587, the warrant was signed. The order was carried swiftly to Fotheringhay. Its bearers determined that Elizabeth should have no chance to change her mind. Mary was told she would die the next morning. She received the news with composure. After 19 years of chains, her fate had at last come into focus. To her attendants, she declared that she was ready, that she would die as she had lived, a Catholic queen, faithful to her God. She spent the evening writing letters of farewell, praying and preparing her body for death. She dressed in crimson, the color of martyrdom, beneath her gown. Betrayal had trapped her. Condemnation had sealed her. Now only the axe awaited. Elizabeth Tudor had spent nearly 2 decades balancing on the knife's edge of her cousin's captivity. To keep Mary alive was to invite rebellion. To kill her was to risk scandal and war. For years she chose hesitation, letting Mary languish in castles rather than on the scaffold. But by early 1587, the balance had broken. The evidence of the Babington plot lay in Walsingham's hands, undeniable and damning. Mary's ciphered letters, carefully smuggled in and out of Fotheringhay, carried her tacit approval for Elizabeth's removal. Parliament demanded blood. Elizabeth's counselors pressed their queen for resolution. They warned that as long as Mary lived, Catholic conspirators would rise again and again. Elizabeth resisted. She loathed the idea of killing a crowned queen. To shed royal blood was to set a precedent that could one day return upon her own head. She paced her chambers, biting her nails to the quick, berating her ministers for cornering her into the choice. "Have I not enemies enough?" she cried. "But must you force me to make myself infamous in the eyes of Christendom?" Yet pressure mounted. Her closest advisors, Burghley, Walsingham, Leicester, argued that delay was danger. France muttered of invasion. Spain sharpened its armada. At home, Catholics whispered in taverns and chapels. The kingdom itself seemed to demand action. At last, Elizabeth relented. On February 1st, 1587, she signed the warrant authorizing Mary Stuart's execution. But even as she pressed the quill to parchment, Her conscience balked. She hesitated, scratched the paper, complained aloud that she was being overruled by my counsel. Then, as if trying to wash the guilt from her hands, she gave the warrant to her secretary, William Davison, with vague instructions. Hold it, use it, but do not act without further order. It was a monarch's attempt at evasion, to sign yet not sign, to command yet not command. The council seized the chance. Elizabeth's words were malleable, her intentions uncertain, but her signature was clear. They determined the warrant would be carried out before she could repent. To hesitate further was to risk the Queen's change of heart and the realm's safety. So the papers left London in haste, borne by riders through the winter countryside to Fotheringhay. On the evening of February 7th, Mary was summoned to hear her fate. The chamber was hushed when the officials entered. Mary sat in her chair, wrapped in furs against the chill. When told that her execution was scheduled for the next morning, she did not weep, nor plead, nor rage. She lifted her chin and thanked the messengers. "The news is welcome," she said softly, "for I am prepared to die." She asked for her servants to attend her, for a confessor to hear her last prayers. The officials refused the priest, fearing the spectacle of Catholic ritual, but allowed her women to remain. Mary accepted the denial calmly, declaring she would confess her sins to God directly. The night that followed was one of solemn preparation. She wrote her final letters to her brother-in-law, the King of France, entrusting him with her last testament, to her allies abroad, urging them to remember her as a faithful Catholic. She prayed aloud with her attendants, the flickering candlelight casting her face in golden shadow. She chose her clothing with care. Beneath her black gown she laid crimson, the liturgical color of martyrdom, to be revealed when her body was stripped for execution. She wanted her death to be seen not as treason, but as sacrifice. She brushed her graying hair, arranged her jewels, and prepared herself as though for a royal ceremony. Her women wept as they dressed her, but Mary comforted them. "Weep not," she told them. "It is for my sins that I die, and I shall soon see the face of God." Outside, carpenters labored through the night, building the scaffold in Fotheringhay's great hall. Black cloth draped its timbers, a stark stage raised above the assembled witnesses. Upon it, the block waited, the axe gleaming in the torchlight. As dawn crept over the frozen fields, the castle stirred. Nobles gathered, soldiers took their places, and the household whispered with dread. In the great hall, the scaffold loomed like an altar. In her chamber, Mary knelt upon the floor, praying one final rosary. Then she rose, drew her veil about her shoulders, and prepared to meet her fate. The warrant had been signed, the council had acted, and the Queen of Scots, who had lived 19 years in chains, now faced the dawn of her last day. Morning broke gray and cold on February 8, 1587. At Fotheringhay Castle, the bells tolled, their iron voices echoing across the frozen fields. The people gathered in the great hall murmured prayers or whispered in awe, for they knew they were about to witness something few in England had ever seen: the execution of a queen. The scaffold had been erected overnight at the center of the hall, draped in black cloth. Above it, a great block stood ready, polished by countless blows from the axe. On one side, a stool for the sheriff and nobles. On the other, a space for the executioner, clad in black, his face hidden by a hood. Soldiers ringed the walls, muskets at the ready. When the doors opened, silence fell. Mary Stuart entered, leaning on the arms of her two attendants. She wore a gown of black velvet, a white veil covering her head and shoulders. As she walked, she lifted the veil, revealing beneath it a crimson petticoat, the color of martyrdom. Gasps rippled through the hall. She had dressed for death not as a criminal, but as a saint. Mary mounted the scaffold with measured steps. Though stiff with rheumatism, she carried herself with regal poise. Turning to the assembly, she spoke clearly, her voice steady. "I die a true woman of my faith, a Catholic in the sure hope of salvation." She declared that she had never plotted the death of Elizabeth, that she forgave her enemies, and that she prayed God would preserve England. Witnesses marveled at her composure. Her attendants, Barbara Mowbray and Jane Kennedy, wept openly as they helped her remove her outer gown, leaving her in crimson bodice and skirt. She handed her rosary to one, her handkerchief to the other. The executioner stepped forward, kneeling before her, asking forgiveness as was the ritual. "I forgive you with all my heart," Mary replied. "For now I hope you will give me an end swift and certain." She knelt before the block, placing her neck upon it with dignity. "Into your hands, O Lord," she whispered. The axe fell, but it did not kill her. The first blow struck not her neck, but the back of her head. A cry of horror rose from the crowd as blood sprayed across the block. Mary groaned, stunned but not dead, her body twitching with pain. The executioner raised his axe again. The second blow landed closer, but still failed to sever her head cleanly. Her body jerked. The hall rang with shocked murmurs. Some witnesses turned away, unable to watch. Others gasped prayers, believing they saw divine judgment upon the butchery. Only on the third strike did the blade finally bite through, severing her head from her body. The executioner lifted it high by the hair, crying out, "God save Queen Elizabeth!" But another horror followed. As he held the head aloft, the auburn locks slipped from his grasp, for they were a wig. Mary's head fell, revealing a shorn, gray scalp beneath. Gasps of disbelief echoed through the chamber as the head rolled across the scaffold. The once glorious queen, famed for her beauty, was reduced in death to a frail, disfigured corpse. At that moment, her little dog, which had hidden beneath her skirts, crept out and threw itself against her body, smearing itself in her blood and refusing to be parted from her. The crowd wept at the sight, even hardened soldiers unnerved by the animal's grief. The hall stank of blood and smoke from the torches. Mary's crimson garments, once chosen as symbols of martyrdom, were soaked through with gore. Her attendants cried out in anguish, but they were dragged away as officials rushed to complete the grim ritual. The body was stripped, the block washed, the dog carried out against its will. What should have been a swift and solemn execution had become a grotesque spectacle, a botched killing that horrified even Mary's enemies. Elizabeth's council had wanted a clean, decisive act to erase Mary as a threat. Instead, the execution revealed the brutality of English justice in its rawest form. When news spread across Europe, it was not the legality of the trial that people remembered, nor Elizabeth's hesitation. They remembered the Queen in crimson, the axe that failed, the head that fell with a wig, and the faithful dog that licked her blood. The execution that was meant to silence Mary had instead made her immortal. On that scaffold at Fotheringhay, dignity met savagery. Mary had embraced her fate with grace, but her killers had stumbled, turning her death into a lasting image of horror. The Queen of Scots was gone, but the spectacle of her death was only beginning to shape her legend. The blood had barely dried on the scaffold at Fotheringhay when the ripples of Mary Stuart's death began to spread. To those who witnessed it, the execution was unforgettable. The botched strokes of the axe, the crimson of her martyr's gown, the gray hair revealed beneath the wig, and the little dog that refused to leave her body. These images lingered in memory, whispered in taverns, copied into letters, and carried across Europe. In trying to erase a queen, Elizabeth's government had minted a legend. The first consequence was political. Elizabeth herself reacted with fury when she heard the warrant had been carried out. She had signed it, yes, but she had hoped for delay, for time to reconsider. Now it was too late. She berated her counselors, sending William Davison, her secretary, to the Tower as scapegoat. To foreign ambassadors she wept, claiming she had been tricked, but the tears convinced few. Across Catholic Europe, the message was clear. Elizabeth had murdered a queen, her own kin, in cold blood. In France, Mary's family raged. Her brother-in-law, Henry III, demanded vengeance. In Spain, Philip II seized upon the execution as divine justification for war. Preparations for the Spanish Armada, already underway, now carried the aura of Holy Crusade. To Catholics everywhere, Mary was no longer merely a captive queen. She was a martyr, slaughtered for her faith. Within England, reactions were more complex. Some Protestants celebrated, relieved that the long shadow of Catholic rebellion had been lifted. Ballads declared Elizabeth safe at last, her throne secured by Mary's death. But others recoiled at the cruelty of the scene. Reports of the botched blows, of the dog soaked in blood, unsettled even loyal subjects. For all Elizabeth's careful positioning, her cousin's death cast a pall over her reign. Mary's body, meanwhile, was treated with unease. Officials feared her corpse might become a relic, a rallying point for Catholic devotion. For months, her remains were kept at Fotheringhay, guarded against pilgrims. Only in July was she buried, not in the grandeur of Westminster, but in a quiet Protestant service within Peterborough Cathedral. Even then, the secrecy could not stop the murmurs. People whispered that her soul had ascended as a martyr's, her blood crying out against the cruelty of her captors. Her image began to change almost immediately. Artists painted her in crimson, head bowed in prayer, the axe looming above. Catholic writers circulated accounts of her final hours, emphasizing her piety, her forgiveness of the executioner, her calm acceptance of death. These stories grew into legend. The queen who went to her death with dignity, betrayed by a jealous cousin, slain not for treason, but for her faith. Elizabeth's reputation suffered in ways she could not control. She had long cultivated an image as the Virgin Queen, the bringer of peace and stability. But Mary's execution haunted that narrative. To Catholics abroad, Elizabeth was now Jezebel, the heretic queen who murdered the anointed of God. To Elizabeth herself, the act was a private torment. In later years, she rarely spoke of it, as though silence could erase the stain. But silence could not compete with song, story, and prayer. Across Europe, Mary was remembered in verse and liturgy. Priests intoned her name as intercessor. Mothers told their children of the queen who died in crimson. Her legend joined a long line of Catholic martyrs, binding her fate to that of the Church itself. Over time, the meaning of Mary's death shifted. To some, she remained a reckless intriguer who had gambled and lost. To others, she was the innocent victim of English cruelty. To still others, She was the embodiment of Catholic resistance, her blood planting the seeds of rebellion and renewal. Each retelling sharpened her myth until the messy, botched execution was polished into something eternal. Even after Elizabeth's death in 1603, Mary's legacy endured. Ironically, it was her son, James VI of Scotland, the child she had not seen since infancy, who inherited the English throne. He united the crowns of Scotland and England, fulfilling a destiny Mary herself had once dreamed of. Though she had died condemned as a traitor, her bloodline conquered the very kingdom that had killed her. Decades later, under the reign of her granddaughter, Mary's remains were reburied in Westminster Abbey, close to Elizabeth's own tomb. The two rival queens, once divided by politics, faith, and blood, now lay side by side in England's most hallowed ground. History had woven them together forever. The irony could not be sharper. Elizabeth had sought to silence her cousin, to bury her claim, to erase her presence. Yet Mary's execution gave her a voice louder than life. The sight of the axe failing, of crimson garments soaked in blood, of a dog refusing to leave its mistress. These were not the details of erasure. They were the ingredients of immortality.